الربيع. شوف تم تسميتها تل الربيع بعد احتلال يافا. كانت يافا هون بس صارت تل الربيع.
تيانية لك يا مروان، رحت على يافا وشفتها وانبسطت فيها. بس
فلسطين بلادي حلوية ما شاء الله، مي العصا قد حول عطبرية، لا عذك وحيفها اللي مع بحرها، لا تنسى الناصري هالقلعة العربية، بشر بيسان برجعة أهلها.
نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يمليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا بأن القدس هي عربية، وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية، وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل البعيد.
هي إسرائيل، هي أرضنا.
إسرائيل أرضنا، أرض 42.
هي أرضنا، هي فلسطين المحتلة.
48.
أرضنا فلسطين المحتلة، برافو عليك. هي حيفا، يافا، عكا، هي أراضينا المحتلة، أراضي 48 اللي احتلتها إسرائيل ب 48. احتلتها إسرائيل ب 48 هي أراضي فلسطينية، رح تضلها فلسطينية، وإن شاء الله رح ترجع لنا بيوم وتبطل تحت سيطرة الاحتلال.
For several decades now, politicians, clerics, and school teachers living in the areas known as the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem have been teaching their children, teenagers, and young adults that the whole of the land of Israel, in fact, belongs to the Arab people who are today known as the Palestinians. This claim is widely propagated throughout the Palestinian media and education system, and further afield in Muslim-dominated countries in the Middle East. The claim goes on to assert that the Jewish people have no historic connection with Jerusalem, and that they are in fact trying to Judaize the holy city, and that the Jewish presence there is illegal. Moreover, this claim is now becoming widely believed among many in the Western world. So what historic and legal claim do the Palestinian Arabs have over Jerusalem and the land of Israel? Jewish writings, dating back over 2,000 years, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirm there was a historic Jewish presence here in Jerusalem well before the time of Christ. Archaeological sites such as this confirm that fact. Christian records confirm that a Jewish temple stood up there on what the Palestinians call Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, at the time of Christ. Jewish historical records show that Jerusalem was in fact the capital city of the people of Israel 1,000 years before Christ. These stone steps date back to the time of King Herod, and there are many other examples of Herodian structures across the Middle East. Even Islamic sources, such as this publication dating back to 1924, when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was in charge of the Haram al-Sharif in the British Mandate period, acknowledges that there had once been a Jewish temple standing here, and these steps, these stone steps, lead up to it. In the year 70 AD, the Romans destroyed not only the temple, but the entire Jewish capital was destroyed too. The historian Josephus Flavius records that more than 1 million inhabitants of Jerusalem were killed, and the rest were taken off to Rome as slaves. So how did the Jewish homeland, the land of Israel, come to be known as Palestine?
Palestine is not even the original name of the land that is denominated Palestinian land. Palestine is not a Hebrew word, it's not an Arab word, it's a Roman word. That land was originally Eretz Israel. It took the name of Palestine under later occupations.
Palestine was reused as Palestine as we know it today by Hadrian when he occupied the country in 135 following the Bar Kokhba revolt. He really wanted that the Judea will be forgotten. And that is the main reason why he changed the name to Palestina, to Palestine.
The final Jewish rebellion against Rome in the early 2nd century, known as the Bar Kokhba uprising, was brutally quashed by the Romans. Jews were barred from entering their ancient capital city, Jerusalem, until the 4th century. Even though most Jews had either been killed by the Romans or exiled and taken off as slaves, there were small Jewish communities scattered across other parts of the Jewish homeland.
There's no real Arab connection until the 7th century, maybe a little bit before that with the Nabateans. But basically what happens is in the 7th century, starting in just a couple of years after the death of Muhammad in 632, then Arab armies come in and they conquer the whole of Syria. They go on to conquer most of the rest of the known world at the time.
From the early 16th century, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. It was the Ottoman Sultan, who was known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem as we see them today. At its zenith, the Islamic Ottoman Empire dominated the whole of southeastern Europe, as well as much of North Africa and the Middle East. However, by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was well in decline and had become dependent on trade with European powers such as France, Germany, and Great Britain, and also Russia for its economic survival. Great Britain was the first Western nation to establish a consulate in Jerusalem. The reason given for their presence here was for the protection of the Jewish people, which by the 1840s was the largest single ethnic group in Jerusalem. In 1863, British consul James Finn, who was living here inside the Jaffa Gate, conducted a census of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The figures were published the following year. Out of a total population of 15,000, 8,000 were Jewish. The other 7,000 were made up of Muslims and Christians. So by then, Jerusalem had a Jewish majority population.
For over 20 centuries, the city of Jerusalem was almost completely composed of or limited to the old city. If you look at Jerusalem in the 1st century and the 5th century, all the way up to the 19th century, Jerusalem was the old city. There was very little outside the walls.
So to sum up, the city of Jerusalem up to the mid-19th century was contained entirely within the city walls. There was no West Jerusalem or East Jerusalem in those days. There had been a resident Jewish community continually here since the Middle Ages at least. And by the 1860s, the historic records show the overall majority of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish. When you look at the eyewitness accounts of people who travelled to the Holy Land in the 19th century, they speak of a land that was both desolate and sparsely populated. The surveys undertaken by the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1870s confirm that. There is absolutely no historic record of an Arab people who called themselves the Palestinians, let alone a Palestinian Arab entity whose capital city was Jerusalem. Palestine then was not a nation or even a state. It was an area of the Ottoman Empire ruled from Constantinople, also known as the province of southern Syria.
Nobody had any thoughts of Palestinian nationalism at that time, whatever, because there was no such place as a state of Palestine. There never had been. So nobody had gone for generations thinking, I'm a Palestinian.
At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Turkish Ottoman Empire sided with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany against France, Russia, and the British Empire. Great Britain, together with her allies from Australia, New Zealand, and troops from across the British Empire, fought against the Turks, who were backed by the Germans. The military campaign to capture Palestine from the Turks that continued through 1917 was beleaguered by one defeat after another. At home, the British government was considering the aspirations of the Zionist movement, which led to the Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration is truly a defining moment of history. Why? Because a number of years earlier, the Zionist movement, which took off as a result of the initiatives of Herzl, first his very important document under the name of the Jewish State, where he was looking for a solution to the Jewish problem. This document really is the beginning of the story. To understand the importance of the Balfour Declaration, we've got to go back to him. And his proposal, his solution was, we need to end the homelessness of the Jews. We need a home. We need a state. And then he had this conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, brought together 200 prominent Jews from around the world and did something rather miraculous. He got them to unite. When the British government, with the help and support of the United States, of France, of Italy, decided that we're going to uphold and support this policy regarding the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, everything changed.
On the 31st of October 1917, as the War Cabinet met here in Whitehall to decide the final wording of what became known as the Balfour Declaration, unbeknown to them at that moment, the Allies won their first victory in the campaign to liberate Palestine from the Turks. Earlier that day, the British and New Zealand forces paved the way for the epic charge of the Australian Light Horse to take the historic town of Beersheba. It was one of the last horse-mounted charges in the history of warfare. The news of the victory in Beersheba reached London on the day that the letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild was signed on the 2nd of November 1917.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done...
The fall of Beersheba into Allied control paved the way for the conquest of Jerusalem and to bring the ancient Jewish homeland under British rule. The Balfour Declaration, which had the full support of the Allied powers, was a pledge to facilitate the formation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. However, at the time, it was merely a political statement with no legal authority. Contrary to popular belief today, the Balfour Declaration also had support from Arab leaders at the time. In January 1919, Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist organization, met with one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, the Emir Faisal of the Arab kingdom of Hejaz.
They were looking for each other's support in respect to their national aspirations. Their discussions resulted in the signing of an agreement, which is often overlooked. And there are several provisions in this agreement which was signed on January 3, 1919, which make it clear that Palestine is supposed to be the territory for the Jews. In fact, the third article of that agreement specifically mentions the policy of the Balfour Declaration in respect to Palestine. There is no doubt that the spirit and the letter of this agreement relates to a Jewish home in Palestine and a very significant independent Arab state in other parts of the Ottoman Empire.
This is Le Salon de l'Horloge, the room where the opening sessions of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 took place, at the French Foreign Ministry in Le Quai d'Orsay. The Supreme Council of the principal Allied powers invited both Arab and Jewish representatives to present their territorial claims in this room.
It was on February 6, 1919, that the Arab delegation presented its claim to the principal Allied powers. What's very important is to note that in describing the territory where the Arabs would have their autonomy and their independence, he left Palestine out. He refers to Palestine. So at this moment in February of 1919, he's complying with the commitments that he made in the agreement signed with Chaim Weizmann in early January of 1919.
3 weeks later, on the 27th of February 1919, Chaim Weizmann and the Zionist organization presented their claim.
They presented a map. It was a map of Palestine showing that all of the areas that were located west of the Jordan River should be part of the new Jewish state, or the new Jewish national home, and the part that was on the east side of the Jordan River. They were asking for areas that were all full of historical connections and biblical significance. But the area they were asking for stopped before the Hejaz Railway, which went from north to south, all the way to the boundaries of Arabia, because that was an important and strategic railway for those who attended pilgrimages in that part of the world.
The Supreme Council of the principal Allied powers adjourned the consideration of future dispositions in the former Ottoman Empire until after the League of Nations had been constituted, which also happened at the Paris Peace Conference.
In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by the Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and by the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate.
San Remo, the Villa de Vachon. It's in this place that the leaders with the power to make binding dispositions with respect to the Ottoman territories deliberated and made the decision, having heard claims from the Zionist organization in Paris in 1919 during the Paris Peace Conference, having heard submissions from the Arab delegation in respect to what they wanted in the Ottoman territories. Having heard these submissions, a group of them gathered here and made final binding decisions in international law as to who would get what.
What mandates did, what the whole institution of mandates was about, was a way of guaranteeing self-determination of peoples. It was really the first time that international law created and recognized this right.
It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine. It was the Arab inhabitants of the territories of Mesopotamia, Iraq now, Syria and Lebanon that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust or a mandate. Part of it under the trusteeship of or mandate of the French, Syria and Lebanon, part of it under British supervision, Mesopotamia.
San Remo, from the legal point of view, is the major link between the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was a promise, but it wasn't a legal commitment, it wasn't a legal document, it's a vital historic document. But San Remo turned it into an international commitment.
During the San Remo Conference, as the representatives of the powers are trying to determine the scope of the territory to be covered by the mandate for Palestine, the scope of the territory to be the location of the national home of the Jewish people, the question is asked, what should Palestine be? Lord George refers to a specific map from a famous geographer, an expert in the Middle East, in Palestine, George Adam Smith, refers to map 34, which is a map which depicts the kingdoms of David and Solomon, areas on the west side of the Jordan River, east side of the Jordan River. He then explains to the French representative, Millerand, that we must give the territories from Dan to Beersheba to the Jewish people if we are going to recognize properly their claim to the historical connection with the Jewish people. Also, you find a multitude of communities, of villages, of cities in the area that we would describe today as the West Bank or the disputed territories. The recognition was given that there was a connection between the Jews and these communities. It's also very interesting to note that if we look at the map, of course, at the center of it is Jerusalem.
The San Remo Resolution of April 1920 was later unanimously endorsed by all 51 countries of the League of Nations. It was a watershed moment in the history of the Jewish people, who had been exiled from their national home for almost 2,000 years.
When you look at the discussions between Lloyd George and the other representatives of France and Italy on April 25, and I have the minutes to support this, it's clear that the intent is to give what was on the map, discussed during the meeting, to the Jewish people for their national home.
One person who played a prominent role in the mandate was Winston Churchill. In 1921, he was appointed Colonial Secretary, which gave him the responsibility of implementing the mandates in the former Ottoman Empire. From childhood onwards, Winston Churchill was a lifelong friend of the Jewish people, and especially Chaim Weizmann. His father, Randolph Churchill, had been a friend of Britain's first Jewish Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, which left a lifelong impression on Winston as a young man. However, Winston Churchill, as Colonial Secretary in the early 1920s, is probably best remembered for the division of Palestine before the mandate was ratified. Following the Cairo Peace Conference of March 1921, Churchill was under pressure to fulfill the aspirations of Emir Faisal and his brother Abdullah. As a result, he drew a line down the Jordan River, and 77% of Palestine was designated for Arab settlement exclusively.
The decision was made by the British in 1921 at a time when they had no right by themselves to do this. But it was subsequently endorsed and adopted in 1922 by the Council of the League of Nations. An Arab state was also created and established within the boundaries of what was described as Palestine. So in this day and age, when we talk about the establishment of a Palestinian state in what is referred to as the West Bank, it's really the creation of an Arab state. Palestinians are Arabs. This would be, in fact, the creation of a second Arab state, since one was created in 1922.
In formulating legally binding instruments, there was a recognition of the cultural, historic roots of the Jewish people in that land. That it was more than just a legal decision, it was based in the cultural heritage of the Jewish people.
They are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the great powers at the time, by the equivalent of the UN at the time.
Which means that if they can establish that they had a vibrant community in Jerusalem, or in Hebron, or in Shiloh, and in different areas of the Holy Land, they've been given the right to reconstitute these communities. The key to Article 2 is the decree the enactment of the policy of the Balfour Declaration. It becomes part of international law.
Article 2 of the mandate states, the mandatory, that is Great Britain, shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative and economic conditions as will secure the Jewish national home.
The Mandate of Palestine was quite specific about who was the beneficiary of this right of self-determination. The preamble to the mandate tells us that the mandate was created in order to reconstitute the Jewish homeland on its ancient land. If you read through the mandate, you'll see there are a number of provisions that were designed to guarantee that. The mandatory authorities, the British, were supposed to cooperate with the Jewish agency in running the mandate. They were supposed to encourage and facilitate the acquisition of citizenship by Jews, immigration by Jews, close settlement of Jews on the land. So there are all these provisions that show us that it was a mandate designed to guarantee the self-determination of the Jewish people.
The whole idea of the mandate was for the Jews to be given the right to immigrate so that the population could increase, so that while the trust is ongoing, they would be stronger, more numerous, and then could declare the independence of their country. That was a whole strategy.
It's worth noting here that the mandate does not name any other ethnic group or any other peoples than the Jewish people as far as obtaining through the mandate political authority over this territory. It does mention the non-Jewish communities and does preserve for them, by the language of the mandate, their civil and religious rights, but all the political rights were reserved to the Jewish people.
I want to underline that the primary objective of the mandate for Palestine was to grant political rights in respect to Palestine to the Jewish people. It was applied in favor of the Arabs in the area of Mesopotamia, in the area known as Syria and Lebanon. But in Palestine, the political rights of self-determination was exercised in favor of the Jewish people. As we turn to Jerusalem, it's important to understand the centrality of Jerusalem in Jewish history and Judaism in order to understand how one can reconstitute what these Jewish people used to have.
So by 1922, there were 3 mandates for the purpose of forming 4 Arab nations, all of which had gained their independence by 1946. And so the agreement that Chaim Weizmann made with Emir Faisal back in 1919 was entirely fulfilled. However, the agreement was quickly abandoned by the Arabs.
The Jews are doing what the Arabs were never able to do, which is really run a very successful agricultural society. And in the meantime, you have, of course, those who are already resisting the Jewish presence. So they start in Hebron in 1929, carrying out small massacres and so on. So there's that unhappiness. It is developing.
Britain starts to turn her back on the Jewish people, starts to diminish the rights that were already given in the mandate for Palestine, contrary to their obligations as mandatory.
Early on, the British mandate over Palestine had started to run into serious trouble with a series of Muslim Arab uprisings under the leadership of Haj Amin al-Husseini. By the mid-1930s, Palestine had become almost ungovernable. By this time, Adolf Hitler was in power and the persecution of Jews in Germany had begun. In order to appease the Mufti and his followers, in case they sided with the Nazis, which they ended up doing anyway, the British government began to introduce measures to seriously restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. The end result was the infamous MacDonald White Paper of May 1939, This white paper would have disastrous consequences for the Jewish people. It came at a time when Jews in Europe were fleeing from the Nazis and virtually no country would take them. The white paper restricted the number of Jews that would be allowed to settle in Palestine to a total of just 75,000 over the next 5 years. Moreover, after that 5-year period, any further Jewish immigration would only be permitted if the Arabs agreed to it. Clause 14.1 of this white paper also indicated that the Jewish population should not exceed 1/3 of the total population of Palestine. With a 2/3 Arab majority, many of them hostile to the Jewish presence, the political rights of the Jewish people were completely compromised.
As an international lawyer, I can say this: there's absolutely no doubt that when Great Britain decided to introduce the white paper and make it part of the law, it violated the material obligations imposed upon it by the Mandate for Palestine. It was not only shameful, but it was wrong in law. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who could have escaped Europe, who could have survived, are stuck in Europe and end up in the death camps.
During the second half of May in 1939, a furious debate over the white paper took place in the House of Commons. One of its fiercest opponents was Winston Churchill.
After the period of 5 years, no further immigration will be permitted unless the Arabs of Palestine are prepared to acquiesce to it. Now there is the breach. There is the violation of the pledge. There is the abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. There is the end of the vision, of the hope, of the dream.
This is the British-built detention camp at Athlete, where many thousands of so-called illegal immigrants were imprisoned. But under the terms of the Mandate, which was a binding instrument in international law, they weren't illegal at all. They had every right to be in Palestine. Instead, they were incarcerated here in conditions resonant of Nazi concentration camps in Europe. Many were even transported here in railway wagons, similar to those used by the Nazis. At least here, they were treated less inhumanely. This place was a temporary home for thousands upon thousands of Jewish refugees during the last 10 years of British rule over Palestine. Many were shipped onto other British prison camps in places such as Mauritius, in the Indian Ocean, or later, Cyprus. Meanwhile, in Europe, at least 6 million Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis and their collaborators. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, many of whom had lost all of their family members and their property, were now homeless refugees with nowhere to go. The end of World War II also saw the dissolution of the League of Nations. It was superseded with the formation of the United Nations in 1945.
The Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
How did the dissolution of the League of Nations and the formation of the United Nations affect the rights of the Jewish people under international law?
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations, so that anything that was decided under the League of Nations, such as the San Remo Resolution, such as the Mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
In the aftermath of World War II, the overwhelming majority of the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in Europe who had survived Auschwitz and the other death camps wanted just one thing: to return to their ancestral homeland in what was then known as Palestine. But the British government, contrary to the terms of the mandate she had signed up to in 1922, kept the doors of what had been designated under international law as the Jewish homeland firmly closed. The Holocaust survivors tried to reach their ancestral home in every way possible, mostly in small, unseaworthy vessels like the one behind me. This is a memorial to more than 3,000 of them who drowned making that perilous journey, while trying to run the British naval blockade of their promised homeland. Those who did make it were imprisoned in detention camps, either here in Atlit or on the island of Cyprus, by the very nation who had been mandated to recreate a national home for the Jewish people and to encourage their immigration. Then in July 1947, something happened that would publicly expose the plight of these homeless Jewish refugees: the Exodus incident.
Out of Palestine comes the camera story of the Exodus, the Jewish immigrant ship that highlights new violence in the Holy Land.
The British government sent its 4,500 Holocaust survivors back to Europe to be imprisoned again in displaced persons camps in the very country they were fleeing from, Germany. The late Yossi Harel was the commander of the Exodus operation in July 1947.
Many people connected that the ship, the state really was born when the Exodus came to Haifa and was the center of the fight to bring any Jew who wanted to come to Israel, and the reaction of the world opinion. They saw the injustice which was done to people who survived Auschwitz. They don't have a place in this world. The only place which we believed we can have was Palestine.
It just so happened that members of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine were present at Haifa port when the Exodus arrived. What they witnessed was the catalyst that brought about the historic Resolution 181 at the UN General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
It is often claimed that this historic vote not only gave legitimacy to the State of Israel in international law, but also to the Palestinian Arabs for their own state as well. Is this the case?
The answer is no. Generally speaking, in international law, General Assembly resolutions are not binding. If the Jewish people and the Arabs had agreed to enter into a treaty based on the terms of resolution, then rights and obligations could have been created in international law. But that didn't happen.
The Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory. And moreover, the Arabs have actually not even recognized the right of the Jewish people to have a sovereign state.
Not only did the Arabs reject Resolution 181 out of hand, but the very day after it was carried, they resorted to armed conflict against the Palestinian Jews. The aim? To try to thwart the possible emergence of any Jewish nation and to make Resolution 181 null and void. Following Resolution 181 in the United Nations General Assembly, the declaration of a Jewish state in Palestine looked pretty certain. However, the surrounding Arab countries swore that they would invade and destroy an independent Jewish state as soon as it was declared. Instead of helping the Jewish community of Palestine to defend itself, Britain had imposed an arms embargo on the Jewish fighting forces, while at the same time arming and training the armies of Egypt and Jordan.
Even before 1947, you had the Iraqi Prime Minister calling for jihad against the Jews in Palestine. Once 1947 happens, almost everybody is doing it, not calling for war, they're calling for jihad by the name jihad.
On the 14th of May 1948, Britain withdrew its forces from Palestine, thus ending its administration as the mandatory power. Later that same day, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel in this very hall. It was the most momentous event in 2,000 years of Jewish history.
You are listening to the voice of David Ben-Gurion, proclaiming the independence of the State of Israel.
אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי.
By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and of the resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Medinat Yisrael, the State of Israel.
מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
And so the Jewish nation was reborn in the homeland from which it had been expelled nearly 19 centuries earlier. The commitment made to the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration had eventually come to fruition. Sadly, in the end, the rebirth of the Jewish nation happened in spite of Britain, rather than because of us. And even then it was only in a fraction of the territory allotted to them at the San Remo conference. The very day after Ben-Gurion's Declaration of Independence, 5 Arab armies invaded the Jewish state and attempted to annihilate it. That attempt failed. Nevertheless, 7 decades later, the State of Israel continues to live under the constant threat of war, and its legitimacy and even its very existence continues to be challenged.
The name Palestine was adopted by the non-Jewish Palestinians, and they say, we are the true Palestinians. We belong in the land. We are the indigenous people. And these Jews came in later and created this colonial thing called Israel.
What Israel has had to do is effectively just give. And we've seen this for so long now that it seems to me to be an obvious part of Palestinian diplomacy. They just take.
The problem is not land, and the problem is not Israel. The problem is our essence as Jews.
70 years ago, the United States was proud to be the first nation in the world to recognize the State of Israel. But as you well know, the work we began on that day was left unfinished. The United States of America will finally acknowledge Jerusalem is Israel's capital.